there.
Love it. Love it. Look, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. When it comes to government, when it comes to the law, tax law, the tax cheats that are associated with those who take the most out of society. I'm talking about the top 1/10 of 1%. This guy has written chapter and verse on this literally. He's a Trumpologist. He's the co-founder of DCReport.org. He joins us so generously on Tuesdays. He's David Cay Johnston, everybody. Yeah. Hi, David Cay Johnston.
Hello, Mark.
David, I saw something actually on the website that you sort of have, you co-founded it, but you've announced that you're kind of pushing away from daily stuff. And it's about what's going on in Florida. I mean, this is a wild thing associated with making bloggers and opinion writers register with the state.
If they're paid, correct. And this won't pass even with the current U.S. Supreme Court constitutional muster. But it tells us something. It tells us that the DeSantis wing of the Republican Party, and I would argue the MAGA wing as well, so you're talking about most of the party at that point, they don't believe in our Constitution. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in government officials being accountable, and as we know now very well, they don't believe in elections, at least not free, fair, and honest elections. And on top of this, they embrace without challenge the notion that if you believe or say or are interested in something that we don't approve of, we're going to cut you off. And this is just so fundamentally anti-American, but I think it's also unleashed an element we've had in American culture from the beginning, a culture that doesn't want democracy, especially if it means people who are not part of the white dominant culture running that democracy.
Well, I mean, the politics of white grievance really have taken a front seat in a more naked way than I ever thought they would in a culture in America that I thought was sort of evolving to at least make that impolite,
Well, that's, of course, what the term political correctness was about. People were upset that they couldn't freely use racial and gendered and other slurs. And that was sort of code for that. And the fact is, in polite society, in any white collar job in America, you had to behave well with good manners. These people have no interest in manners when it comes to people they don't identify with because they don't regard them as people. And let's remember that up until the Emancipation Proclamation and the 3 civil rights amendments following the Civil War, Black Americans literally were not human beings. In fact, they were property. So they could be treated worse than a dog or a cow. And there are a lot of people who still have the residue of that era. And we're seeing this in these things like we don't want to have drag shows. So they know they can't ban them outright. So they say, well, we're trying to protect the children. And who do you have? People like the governor of Tennessee, who was in drag when he was in college. Rudy Giuliani, who appeared in drag on Saturday Night Live. I think, but I may be wrong, that there's even a Donald Trump scene somewhere where he appears in drag.
There's never been anything like this.
If you don't know it, then nobody knows it because you know every cell of Trump.
That's quite the case.
Yeah, we talked about this drag thing actually yesterday on the show. Kim had a great guest, but your sense of the dehumanization of certain minorities, and of course the Nazis did this so effectively with the Jews in Nazi Germany, which sort of legitimized, if you will, this extermination of all of these people, and it's done in other ways that involve ethnic cleansing and this sort of thing.
Well, the Japanese military in World War II, the way that their attitudes about other cultures and societies, and Russia right now today under the modern czar Vladimir Putin, the same thing. They basically regard people who live in Ukraine, unless they are ethnic Russians, as not as subhuman species, and therefore it's okay to take over their country.
Do you see, just because you mentioned Ukraine, do you see this growing drumbeat among certain members of the GOP, and it seems to be broadening, and it's kind of a message that's getting out there through right-wing media, of which there is a lot. I mean, I love the idea that sort of like the media's left. You can't turn on talk radio and find anything progressive, anything even middle of the road. And talk radio drives a lot of people to the polls with a lot of opinions that they pick up there. But anyway, do you see anything with this drumbeat growing associated with both an accountability? It starts with an accountability, which is kind of a legitimate thing when it comes to monies and support directed to Ukraine. But it goes beyond that, so that it almost borders on pulling back significantly from our support of the Ukraine.
Well, this is one of the most troubling things that I see in our society, Mark. Vladimir Putin, in writing, and I've read a lot of his words, and in speeches and videos that you can go find very easily with an internet search, has said for decades now that the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he wants to put it back together. Chechnya, Georgia, now Ukraine, Moldova, Poland, the three little Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, those are all next if we don't stop Putin here. And the cost of this war is bupkis compared to the cost of a 30 or 40 or 50-year war, and empowering a Kremlin with such a larger population and a much greater ability to destabilize the world. So I really, if when I was in junior high school or high school in Santa Cruz, if a history or social studies teacher had said, the day is going to come when the Republican Party is going to take up the cause of the Kremlin and argue the Kremlin's cases, and a presidential candidate is going to win an election after the Kremlin contacts him and says, we want to help you win, and he accepts the help, which Donald Trump's campaign did. I would have gone to the principal's office and said, hey, you got a teacher who is crazy, absolutely crazy. And yet look at where we are. This is just an astonishing development, but it goes to the fact that the Kremlin, the Trump and DeSantis Republicans, they believe in authoritarianism. They believe in might makes right. They don't believe in accountability and democracy and liberty.
Look, that's such a clean take. But what I might add to that or question is, how many of the American people, what portion of the American populace also is part of the makes right, and I want to seize power regardless of how I do it. So that is why the elections begin to be an election deniability, et cetera, whatever story you want to float, becomes such a key part of taking that power and maintaining it.
Well, it's a minority of Americans, but the reason you're seeing all of the efforts to suppress the vote and make it difficult for people to vote in key areas is because the only way a minority can have power is by suppressing the overall vote. If we had universal voting in this country, like in Australia, where, now and then they prosecute some person for not voting. They don't really go around harassing people for it, but they have enormously high turnout. If we got rid of Tuesday voting, which was instituted so that working people couldn't vote because their bosses wouldn't let them go vote. If we had universal vote by mail, as Oregon and Washington and some other places have, and it's worked very well, we would not have MAGA Republicans running the House. We would have a much more nuanced and thoughtful debate about our policies. And it would also make the Democrats be more accountable to the public, because they would be dealing not with a bunch of, frankly, crazies, but dealing instead with thoughtful, rational people who actually are putting forth ideas. And all of this is very troubling, but it's not a majority of us. I mean, let's just not lose sight of the fact that Biden got 7 million more votes, 10% more votes than Donald Trump did. And while he got a lot of votes, Biden got more, and all we have to do is get people to register and then actually show up at the polls.
Well, then this is quite in keeping with that point you're making, because the point I tend to make when I hear, of course, it's indisputable what you've just said, that you need to get more Americans voting, more Americans involved. But this is, of course, happening at the same time that some of the other stuff that you've pointed to on this show is happening, like reducing the number of polling places, reducing the ways in which you can vote, increasing the things that you have to produce to essentially allow you to vote in many states. And then there's this. Florida, West Virginia, and Missouri withdraw from the bipartisan effort aimed at maintaining accurate voter rolls. This is a nonprofit system that helps participating states keep their registration rolls accurate and up to date by analyzing voter data and sharing reports with members in order for them to update their voter rolls, remove ineligible voters, and investigate potential voter frauds. This is legit work that's being done. But you have 3 states joining Alabama and Louisiana who have previously retreated from this partnership. And I'm wondering if these GOP-led state withdrawals have any effect on this very process to which you've pointed.
Oh, I think they will. It will make it easier to remove people from the voter rolls, as Florida and Georgia have in particular done, on any specious grounds. Florida, back in, I think it was the 2000 election, before that election, hired a company to go through the voter rolls and find people who shouldn't be on them because they changed their address or they moved out of state, etc., or had a felony record. So they would find someone named David Johnston. Everybody named David Johnston, if one person had a felony, they'd just remove them all from the voter rolls. They didn't tell you you'd been removed. You'd go to vote. You'd say, what are you talking about? I've never been arrested in my life. And it was a significant number of people. Harper's Magazine did really good coverage of this back then, 20-some years ago. And suppressing the vote can be done in many, many ways. What we ought to be doing is encouraging universal voting and the franchise in which everybody who reaches their legal majority of 18 has the opportunity to vote, and to vote with ease. Why would we want to make it hard to vote?
But David, do you think you should have to produce any kind of ID of any sort when you vote?
No, I think that the responsibility is on government to go after you if you are not a proper voter. I don't think it's the voters' responsibility. And first of all, let me make clear about something. In federal and state elections, we have one set of rules. Local ones, we have another one. My local school district in New York State, we have to vote on the school budget every year. All you have to do to vote is show evidence that you live in the school district, your utility bill, your ownership of your home, your property tax bill, if you're a renter, your rental receipt for that address. And people who are not citizens vote in those elections. And since it's your taxes on a property level, I don't know why you shouldn't be able to vote. That's what we're voting about. How much we're going to tax ourselves to support our local schools. But the burden ought to be on the government, especially if you are already a registered voter. There's the famous case of I think she was 96 when it came up, 96-year-old woman back in 2008 who wanted to vote for Obama. She was born in home. The only record of her birth was the entry in the family Bible, and there had been one at the local church, which was burned down by racists when she was young. And she was not, I don't know if she was ultimately allowed to vote or not, but it was a national issue. When one of the episodes of the HBO show, The Newsroom, used it as an example of this effort at voter suppression. So if you've been registered to vote, you ought to be able to vote. If someone challenges you, then we have a system for provisional ballots where your ballot is put aside. And now if it turns out it's irrelevant to count your ballot, then we generally don't count those ballots. But if it's a close election, then you have a proceeding to go through to examine this. And that's the better way to handle this. And because fundamentally, if we're going to be a democracy, the franchise should be universal. It shouldn't be limited.
Right. By the way, because David mentioned the HBO show Newsroom, I'll ask him about another show just because this is my own personal curiosity. And I can't remember if we've asked you this question or not, David. Sometimes we like to, well, you did watch Game of Thrones or you didn't watch Game of Thrones?
Oh, no, I watched Game of Thrones.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I thought it, far more violence and nudity than necessary, but it was, I thought, a brilliant reworking of all the myths in our society, Viking, Persian, etc., into an imagined world, and quite, it is the most watched program apparently in the history of television. More people have seen that than any other television show.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Wow. I read that not long ago in one of the things I get in the mail from Hollywood. Yeah, and the Newsroom, which ran, I think, 4 seasons, especially the first 2 seasons, was an absolutely searing indictment of the news business. I told my fellow New York Times alumni in our private group, you really should watch this thing, because even if you don't like Aaron Sorkin's approach to how he does his shows, this is a just searing indictment of what's wrong with our business.
Well, I watched a few episodes of that actually. The speeches just begin to get obnoxious to me, even though they're quite good. And the Sorkin speeches, but you're right. There was some riveting stuff in there, and some of the speeches are so good. But that's what he does. He puts together a bunch of speeches, and before you know, you have a show. I had a last question for you related to something that we hear a lot about on this show to be asked to you, and that's about the viability of a third party. Now, that's the general question. Yeah. Then I want to get to the other question that's asked of you, which is, could Trump run as a third party candidate? I'd suggest, because there are a lot of red state laws, actually, that would be hard. But I'm curious, it feels as though we're a two-party place, sadly.
Well, the founders, didn't want parties. They were very clear about that. Both Adams and Jefferson, who were bitter enemies, did not want to have parties. But we have them, so we have to accept that that's the reality of things today. No third-party candidate has done well, although I'd point out that Eugene V. Debs in the 1920 presidential election was in prison, federal prison, and he got 900 and some thousand votes for president of the United States. Cox, the loser, got about 9 million, and the winner got about 13 million. So that's 3% of the vote that he got. And Donald Trump, there are 3 outcomes as I see it coming forth with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is highly likely, even if he is indicted in multiple places, to get the Republican nomination. The more people who announce as Republicans, the better it is for Donald Trump, because he can go through and just pick them off one at a time, as he did in 2016. If you're a fan of the show The West Wing, that's Jed Bartlett, the fictional president, tells about, I wasn't supposed to win, but we kept picking people off one at a time. So the scenarios I see are Donald Trump gets the Republican nomination. He loses. There's no way he wins the popular vote, and the Democrats have gotten smarter about turning out the vote in the key electoral states. Second option, Donald Trump doesn't get the nomination, runs as a third-party candidate, a write-in in a number of states, and we've had people win write-ins. Lisa Murkowski, the Republican senator from Alaska, lost her primary in the party because she's not a MAGA person, but she got back in because of write-in votes. But in any event, he loses. And the third option is he tells his followers, stay home and don't vote. It's all corrupt. Guess what? The Democrats win the White House. I mean, I just don't see a scenario under which Donald Trump gets back into office. And the candidates they're running, I mean, Nikki Haley, as you've seen in the polling and the other stuff, has a support level of close to 0 among the Republicans. And of course, her background as a South Asian born in the United States, whose family, they're Christians, but they're Indian, East Indian. She's not acceptable to a large segment of the Republican Party. Mike Pompeo, I don't see where he has any charisma or appeal whatsoever, not to mention that there's plenty of evidence that he's just morally corrupt to the core. Ron DeSantis doesn't seem to be exciting anybody. Fox News keeps trying to push Ron DeSantis. There was a hilarious episode of Fox and Friends where one of the hosts at a restaurant where they bought everybody breakfast in Florida goes around asking people, who are you for? They all say Trump. He sees a woman with a DeSantis shirt on. He goes over to her and he says, so you're for DeSantis? And she says, I don't know, Trump, DeSantis, I don't think it makes a difference. And I don't think that Ron DeSantis, with his plans to make it possible to sue teachers and take away tenure from professors and make sure that you don't know the truth about American history regarding slavery and Jim Crow, I don't believe he's electable. And, this is not good for the country. We need to have, if we're going to have parties, we need to have parties that are focused on promoting ideas. And the closer you get to the center, the better you are going to be as a society over time in working things through. And fundamentally, it looks like the Republicans are going to crash and burn, and what may emerge is something other than them. Remember, the Whigs went away after the 1856 election, and that's how we got the Republicans, who used to be the Democrats, by the way, before the Civil War. The pre-Civil War Democrats became the Republicans. But, Mark, this is a terrible thing for the country to have one political party that's just nuts. And with leaders like, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, Joe Biden was trying to not erupt in laughter discussing her the other day. She's a joke.
She is a joke and laughable, but I would also say that there's no but. I mean, full stop. She's a joke and laughable. On the other hand, she's on committees. She has a following. Because of gerrymandering, she'll continue to win re-election.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
And sadly, she reflects the kind of extremism and the sort of make up the facts as you go along and scream them as loud as you can that is typifying more and more of the discourse.
Right. And we're seeing in the oversight hearings that Jim Jordan is running that there's nothing there. It's just like Benghazi. It's a whole lot of made up nonsense and hot air that when you get to the end of the day, the Benghazi committee's report, at the end of the day, I can tell you what it said. I read the thing and it says, in essence, nothing there. We wasted your time, folks.
Over and over again, we wasted your time.
Yes. And so, I mean, this is not governance. This is not promoting better ideas. I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party said, we're the party of ideas. And whether you liked them or not, you had to say, yeah, boy, in the 80s, the Republicans put forth a lot of ideas. Let's lower taxes on the rich because then they'll reinvest and create more jobs. Yeah, that didn't work out so well. Let's deregulate. There is no such thing as debt. There's re-regulation. But let's change the regulations to favor the companies rather than the customers or the workers. That didn't work out so well either. Let's open up air travel. That one worked out quite well, actually. Airfares fell dramatically, and efficiencies were introduced because there was real competition. Although
the FAA is the victim of regulatory capture, wouldn't you say, David?
Yes. Oh no, almost every federal agency is. There's a solution to this problem. Regulatory capture, for the audience, means that an agency that's supposed to regulate an industry is really captured by that industry. And its focus is on the needs of the industry, not on the needs of the customers, the workers, and the environment. The answer to that is that we need to create paid staffs of people whose job is to act as advocates for the public. And we have them in some places. New Jersey has an elected official called the public advocate. New York City has one. Utility cases. Trying to get the newspaper to pay attention, as I used to do when I was at the LA Times in the 70s and the 80s, to how the utility companies were inefficiently spending money and causing your rates to be higher than they need to be, which is a critical issue for business, especially small businesses. Today is just impossible. The New York Times is the only big paper that has somebody who actually understands utility regulation, a guy named Ivan Penn. He doesn't write very often, unfortunately. And the answer to that is to have a staff whose job is to argue on behalf of the ordinary citizens, to be the critics representing the public. Because how much time are you going to take, Mark, to go fight the 3 penny a day ripoff by the oil pipeline companies?
Right. Right.
You know, they get by my count more than $3 billion a year by getting 3 pennies a day from every one of us. Nobody's going to fight that. But if you had a staff, that $3 billion a year, you could finance it with the interest off the $3 billion a year, and they'd be able to argue, no, these policies are contrary to the public interest. They don't serve any public good. And when you have monopoly actions, they create what economists call a deadweight loss. The monopolists get a lot of money, and the money that we give the monopolists is effectively to the rest of the society the same as if we put it in a bag, weight it down with rocks, and throw it in the Pacific.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it seems as though the structure of growing consumer-based, public-based legislation, that's just getting smaller and smaller. That support, I mean, this to be continued. Find David through his books, I think. They're just terrific. And if you are curious about Trump and who Trump really is, he's written a bunch on that. If you're curious about the legal cheat that goes on at the highest levels of American society when it comes to big money, David has written on that as well. Check it all out. He's the best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize winner. David, so kind to be with us on Tuesdays. Thank you, my friend.
Take care, Mark, and I hope you're fully well.
Thank you. David Cay Johnston, everybody. Very, very cool. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.